What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Called to Communion here on EWTN. It's the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you've got a question about the Catholic faith, we would love to hear from you. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening outside of North America, please use the U.S. country code and then dial 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply for some folks. Also, you can send us an email whenever you want, 24/7, ctc@ewtn.com is the address, ctc@ewtn.com. All right, Charles Beery is our producer. Ryan Penny is handling the phones. He'll be screening those calls that when you call the station, that's the first voice that you're going to hear. Also, Jeff Burson is on social media. He's our guru for all things online. So if you want to pose a question via YouTube or Facebook, just put that question in the comments section of the YouTube site or the Facebook site. You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, Jeff will shoot that down to us here in Studio 1. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Very well. How are you, sir?
Oh, I'm doing decent.
You remember yesterday we took a question from a woman who said, does the church hate gays? Do you remember that?
I remember that.
We have a follow-up question here. This is from Rita, listening on The Rock out of Cleveland. She says, Dr. Anders, a, quote, Christian who was quite well-versed in Scripture, said to me, in reference to people who presently do terrible sins, quote, God doesn't love these people. He hates these people. Well, I've never heard a Christian say such a thing. Is there something basic that I don't understand? This fellow brought up Pharaoh and Judas. He cited Romans 9:13, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. He also cited Psalm 5:5, you hate all evildoers, and also Psalm 11:5, his soul hates the wicked. So does God ever hate anyone? How do you explain these scriptures? Thanks, Rita.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So I think it's really helpful to back up and first consider the nature of God as he's revealed to us in Scripture and the teaching of the Catholic faith, and also what we can discern by God philosophically.
Okay.
And what the Catholic Church teaches about God is that God doesn't change. God is incapable of change. God is eternal. He's outside of time. He has no parts. There's nothing in virtue of which various aspects of God are in composition, because he has no aspects. He is his own existence, and every one of his properties is his essence. He is as singular and unitary as it gets. All right, and doesn't even have passing temporal states. Right, and he's not one way at 9:05 and another way at 9:06. Right, he is eternally, unchangeably, the one utterly simple, one beyond all one. Okay. When you think that, when you understand that, you recognize that God can't have passing emotional states. So God doesn't regard any individual or nation or planet or universe and like it one minute and dislike it another minute.
Okay.
Right? And God's very nature is love. St. John tells us that God is love. God is love. And love is the intention, the desire of benevolence and union towards other rational beings. So that's God's disposition towards the world. God is eternally, unchangeably love, willing the good of the creatures that he made and desiring to be in union with them. And however, we can change. We can change our subjective receptivity to the unchangeable God and his love. And such that if we deliberately turn away from God, we can experience God's awesome power and holiness and truth and justice as alienating and rejecting, right? But it's not because God himself is alienating and rejecting, but because we are alienating ourselves from him and hating ourselves in that rejection. Let me give you an analogy. My grandfather was a man of astonishing virtue and holiness, goodwill, wisdom, kindness, and compassion. He just beamed goodness. And when I was in high school, I was not a very good guy. All right, I messed around a lot, did a lot of stuff I shouldn't have done, and that weighed on my conscience. My grandfather never condemned me, never judged me, probably didn't even know any of the stuff I was up to. He had so much goodwill towards me. He was, see no evil, hear no evil, and David can do no wrong. But he just loved me in his unchanging, unqualified goodness. Sometimes I would go visit my grandfather, and just being around my grandfather was convicting. Like I would feel really bad about myself, and I'd want to run away sometimes and hide, under the rocks from the goodness and love and unchangeable goodwill of my grandfather, because it was just such a living rebuke to my own lifestyle at the time. And I think that makes sense, right? And that's kind of how we experience God, right? We can turn to something that we know isn't God, turn to something that we know does us no good. Experience inner conflict and torment and alienation and loneliness, all the while clinging to the creatures that are causing pain. And there's God just loving unconditionally. And we're like, stop all that loving unconditionally. You're getting on my nerves. I'm here trying to indulge my passions. And there you are looking over my shoulder, loving me unconditionally like my grandfather, And we experience that as alienation and perhaps rejection. And so that's the way the Catholic faith looks at this language in Scripture. Scripture uses analogical language, right? Anthropomorphic language, sometimes even of God. But we have to purify that of unworthy conceptions, creaturely notions that are not adequate to God's majesty. And so the only thing we can really predicate of God univocally, without qualification, without analogy, is his being, that he is, and even that's analogous, and his love, right? That God is love, right? And everything else we have to kind of qualify with those two primary qualifications. Now, but there are also, I should add, Scripture verses that counterbalance the one your friend brought up, like, while we were yet sinners, God proved his love for us in this, that Christ died for us.
Yes, indeed. All right, Rita, thank you so much for your question. In a moment, we'll get to the phones. We'll begin with Felicia in Indiana. Got a line open for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986 here on Call to Communion on EWTN.
This is Conversations with Consequences, where we delve deeper into issues affecting our church, our country, and our core, the family.
As Catholics, we need to be informed, aware, and able to talk through some of the tough topics that we're facing in our culture and in our world. Conversations with Consequences gives us the tools to do so.
It's not enough to pray. We have to be a light for the world.
Conversations with Consequences, this Saturday at 5 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Give something meaningful this Christmas. A subscription to EWTN's National Catholic Register. It's the award-winning newspaper filled with solid Catholic reporting from the United States, the Vatican, and around the world. The Register includes coverage on the culture of life, Catholic education, book reviews, entertainment, and features that help subscribers engage the culture with confidence in the saving and sanctifying gospel of Jesus Christ. Order a subscription for a friend or one for yourself and get 26 issues for less than $2 per issue. And with your paid subscription, you'll get EWTN's Life of Christ DVD absolutely free. Save even more and get $10 off every additional gift subscription you order. To take advantage of this offer, visit ncregister.com/radio or call 1-800-421-3230 and mention code RADIO. The National Catholic Register. Read faithfully. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. I think pretty much everybody who knows me, Tom Price, knows that I'm a cheapskate. Fortunately, my wife as well is a cheapskate. We wear that as a sort of a badge of honor between us. So we're always looking for the bargain. And when I find out that something is good and free, Well, that raises my eyebrows. Well, let me tell you about something that is good and free, and that is Wings, EWTN's weekly e-newsletter. You can find out about EWTN radio and TV shows, check out items that are now featured on Religious Catalog, and so much more. Wings is a very welcome addition to my inbox. I can't say that about every email that pops up, but I can certainly say it about Wings. It's fantastic. Sign up for Wings at EWTN.com. Just look for the subscribe button. All right, if you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. Here is Felicia in Avon, Indiana, listening on Catholic Radio Indy. Hey there, Felicia. What's on your mind today?
Hi. I was just wondering if you could clarify the Pope's recent... People have been telling me that he's approved gay marriage. Other people say, no, he's just talking about civil union. And I don't really watch TV that much. So,
sure, absolutely.
I don't watch the news or anything.
Absolutely.
So if you can just clarify that for me,
absolutely.
then I'm going to have
absolutely.
to
Absolutely.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. So first of all, before I even address the business with Pope Francis, I will tell you that the Pope has not issued not any formal teaching document or statement on personally on this question of civil unions for homosexual persons. But the Vatican has, the Pope has, Pope John Paul II actually issued the official teaching in his office for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and the official position of the Church is that the Church does not support establishing civil unions for homosexual couples, and certainly doesn't support gay marriage in civil law. So that is the official teaching of the Catholic Church, and has been forever, and it hasn't changed, and it can't change, right? So that's the long and the short of it. And the Pope hasn't contravened or overturned or changed that in any way, all right? Now, secondly, when some journalist quotes a pope who's making private remarks out of context, or even in context for that matter, it is of literally no consequence for the faith of Catholics. Because I mean, it might have an effect on individuals, but in terms of any sort of formal teaching authority, popes making off-the-cuff comments, out of context that's just not how the faith is handed on. It's not this is not the way the Pope authoritatively teaches, right? And even when the Pope acts in an official capacity, he is not immune from error. He's only immune from error under a very strict set of circumstances, and that is when he formally defines something to be believed by all the faithful as revealed by God. And that is a very rare occurrence. Most of the time, even when the Pope is operating in an official capacity, but not employing this charism of infallibility, the attitude of the individual Catholic is to, pay attention, hear what the Pope has to say, recognize that he's got the job of teaching the faith and so forth, and then we go to work, trying to assimilate what was communicated with what we know about the tradition and from sacred history, right? And so the media doesn't approach the Pope that way, especially the non-Catholic media who doesn't understand Catholic theology. They think if the Pope puts on red shoes, everybody has to wear red shoes. It's kind of like the cult of celebrity.
Yeah.
And as if his political or private opinions were somehow determinative for the life of Catholics. And that's just not the way it is. It's not how we relate to the Holy Father, right? So whatever he ends up saying, when it's in some sort of off-the-cuff interview, quoted out of context, I mean, the only reason I even personally bother to read such remarks is I know I'm going to have to engage with them publicly on the radio. But in terms of forming my own Catholic faith, that's just not how the faith is handed on. And we actually have official documents on church teaching, and a great place to go if you want to. What's the official position on this, that, or the other thing? This is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It's promulgated by the Holy See, including Pope Francis, who's continued to establish that as the authoritative reference guide for Catholic teaching. So if you don't know what the Church thinks about homosexual persons or euthanasia or the doctrine of God or whatever it is, I mean, you go to the Catechism of the Catholic Church and you're going to get your answer. That's the way we operate. That's the way we roll. Now, in terms of what he actually said, this came in the context of an interview that was done by a journalist. It had nothing to do. He didn't even make these comments as Pope. All right, this goes back to his days in Argentina, it's very local to a political debate that was going on in that bishopric, quite some time ago, when there was a debate in that country about whether or not they were going to establish gay marriage. And look, when you're operating in real time, trying to do policy, and you've got contending factions, and you're trying to come to some sort of consensus about public policy that you can actually enact in legislation, a lot of times policymakers and commentators will take public positions that may not reflect what they regard as the ideal, because you're dealing with trying to come to a pragmatic determination in highly particular historical circumstances in a pluralistic culture. And you can't translate those kinds of remarks into some sort of categorical moral position that is then imposed on the entire Catholic world. It just doesn't work that way. But in that local context of Argentinian politics, what the Pope is quoted as having said is basically you can't have gay marriage. That's intrinsically immoral. It's bad for civil society.
Right.
But he would concede some situation in which you could establish some form of legal recognition for homosexual couples, if that's the only way you could have them protected, say, like within the healthcare system and forms of public benevolence. That is so far from saying gay marriage is okay. Mm-hmm. It's not even, there's on two different planets.
Yeah.
So, any time the Pope so much as scratches his nose, someone in the media is going to write a dissertation on how he's overturned the entirety of the Catholic faith and we're all now green aliens. Mm-hmm. That's not how you need to get your understanding of the Catholic faith.
Okay. Felicia, thank you so much for your call. Appreciate hearing from you today. Hey, that opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. All right, let's go to Julie in Bakersfield, California, listening on Sirius XM 130, a first-time caller. Hey there, Julie. What's on your mind today?
Well, I recently came back to the faith. My main question is, I was married in the Catholic Church as a young person, and we did divorce, and I remarried. He remarried. My husband passed away, and I have found myself during this crazy COVID time watching and getting back into my religion and actually going back to church, to the Catholic faith, and I was raised Catholic. And my question is, I did not get an annulment, and my first husband, who was, we were married in the Catholic Church, is married. And should I have any concern about his being in a marriage after a divorce? And he was Catholic at the time. He is not a practicing Catholic now.
Okay, so you said
sense?
Yes, it does. You said someone died. Was it your second husband who died?
My second husband passed away.
Okay.
He passed away about 6 years ago. So I have been alone, and going back into the faith, I've actually confessed to adultery because I realize now that was a sin that I felt compelled to confess.
Got
for.
you. Okay.
Anyway,
All right. So I just wanted to make sure I understood who died, all right? Because that's pertinent to the answer to the question. So from the church's point of view, right now, you are presumed to be married to the first man. That's the presumption. Now, if you were to seek an annulment, it is likely that the church would find for nullity in this case, in which case, you wouldn't be regarded as married to that guy. But unless you seek an annulment, the presumption is that you are married to that first fellow, and he to you, which would mean that he would be presently in a state of adultery. And in order for him to rectify that, he would have to seek an annulment, and then he would have to have his present marriage convalidated in the church. Now, from what you've told me, that's not likely to happen, right? Because he's no longer a practicing Catholic. He doesn't regard the church as an authority in his life, so he's not going to bother with what the marriage tribunal says. It's of no concern to him. Should it be of concern to you? I say no. I say no, unless, and this seems to me enormously unlikely, unless you thought you had real sway in his life and could admonish him in a way that he would be likely to listen. That's sounds to me like that's not going to happen. And, the church tells us we have, one of the works of mercy is admonishing the sinner. So there is a time when you can speak truth into someone's life in order to bring them closer to God and kind of get them out of their rut. But we don't go around admonishing every sinner that we meet because we do nothing but admonish sinners all day long. And, of course, we ourselves need to be admonished and take the log out of our own eye and not take it out of somebody else's and all that. So we only really follow that exhortation to admonish the sinner when we think that there's a good chance the person is going to listen to us, and when it's a really grave situation. Well, this is grave. I mean, this is a significant thing in his life, but it's very unlikely he's going to listen to his ex-wife when she comes and says you need to get an annulment. I mean, he's going to think you've got some sort of ulterior motive, and he's not going to pay any attention. If that's the case, you don't have an obligation in this situation. And your own situation, there's nothing wrong with what you're doing now. You've been to confession. You're reconciled to the church and to God. You're following your conscience and following the teaching of the church and trying to live a sacramental life. Well, more power to you. I mean, thanks be to God for that. What a great thing. And we all, ultimately we live and die to our own conscience before God. And you're not going to be judged for your husband's conscience, but for your own. And so you can pray for him. You can love him from a distance in an appropriate kind of way. It's got to be on his conscience to get right with God. You can't make that happen for him.
Is there any regard there to her receiving Holy Communion?
No, I don't believe there is, unless she decided to remarry.
I see.
Right, because right now she's not living in the state of adultery. She's living a continent and chaste celibate life, and there's really nothing she can do to reconcile with her husband. I mean, that's kind of off the table.
Yeah.
And so her conscience right now is clear. I mean, but if she wanted to get married again, she'd have to get an annulment before she could do that.
Very good. Julie, thank you so much for your call. It's Call to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go now to June, also in California, in Laguna Beach, listening on Sirius XM 130. Hey, June, what's on your mind today?
Hello. It's so nice to be on, and we are devout listeners. We have a question about the succession of cardinals and bishops. Apparently in Los Angeles, we don't have a new cardinal because the existing one is still alive, and so we have an archbishop, I guess. So what happens with bishops? How, if they retire or choose not to be a bishop? What happens to them?
Thanks. So first of all, the cardinalate and the episcopacy often are found in the same person, but not always. Like, you don't actually have to be a bishop to be a cardinal, right? I mean, you don't have to have a See and be bishop of, Los Angeles or Washington or something. Sometimes the popes will name just really prominent Catholic prelates as cardinals as an honorific. I mean, I think, for example, about Cardinal Avery Dulles was an example. He was a theologian, and Pope John Paul II named him a cardinal. John Henry Newman, St. John Henry Newman, was named a cardinal by Leo XIII. He was not a bishop, but he was an incredibly important Catholic theologian. And it was interesting, when Newman was named a cardinal, he didn't accept right away, and he really didn't like Rome. He didn't like Rome at all. And at that time, if you were a cardinal, you lived in Rome. And so he wrote the Holy See, and he said, if I accept the being a cardinal, do I have to move to Rome, or can I stay in England? They said, you can stay in England. He said, all right, I'll do it. I'll do it, And in Newman's case, he had felt sort of embattled his whole Catholic life, like that he'd been kind of a controversial figure, and a lot of members of the hierarchy didn't think much of him. They fought with him all the time. And towards the very end of his life, Leo XIII said, I want to make you cardinal. And he said, well, I'll accept, because this is the first time in my entire life that any member of the hierarchy has ever acknowledged that I did anything good. And so he was made a cardinal. So you're not, and a particular see is not necessarily guaranteed that the bishop will become a cardinal, although there are some that are traditional, right? That very, very big, important metropolitan sees, but that doesn't have to be that way. Pope can make anybody a cardinal he wants to. Now, when a bishop retires, he doesn't stop having the sacramental dignity of a bishop, right? He still have the power to ordain sacramentally. He would, and he would be able to confirm and do all the things that sacramental bishops can do. But he would no longer have jurisdiction. Like, he would not be the top dog in the diocese calling the shots. But he still has the sacramental power and dignity of a bishop until he dies. Well, actually, forever.
Okay.
Into eternity.
All right, very good. June, thank you so much for your call. We do appreciate hearing from you in Laguna Beach. What a wonderful area that is. Wow. All right, in a moment here, we're going to get back to the phones and talk with Hebrew in Wellington, Florida, also Hope in Melbourne, Florida, and Lexi in Pell City, Alabama, right here close to EWTN's studios. We have, looks like a couple of lines open right now if you would like to get in on this Thursday program. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986 for Call to Communion. Do stay with us.
The words of Blessed Carlo Acutis.
Our goal must be infinite, not finite. The infinite is our homeland. Heaven has been waiting for us forever.
Unplanned, the true story of Abby Johnson.
I would be the youngest director in Planned Parenthood history.
She believed in a woman's right to choose.
I've had an abortion myself, so I don't have any problem with another woman making the same decision.
Until the day she saw something that changed everything.
Tiny, perfect little baby. And then it was just gone.
Now she's pulling back the curtain on the abortion industry. Unplanned.
Available at EWTNRC.com and the EWTN app.
60 Seconds with Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen.
The Eucharist is the greatest of all the sacraments because it contains in a substantial way the person of Christ, who is the author of life. It is the one sacrament to which all of the other sacraments look. Imagine 6 arrows in a circle, all pointing to a center. The center is the Eucharist. The 6 arrows are the other sacraments. The Eucharist is the sun around which the other sacraments revolve as planets. All the other sacraments share in its power, and they perfect themselves in the celebration of the Eucharist. It is a sacrament that is so sublime that human reason could never guess at it. Divine love is far deeper than we know.
The people you know and trust are on EWTN.
Are we a hoarding culture?
Do many of us have too much stuff?
Let's have a frank and edifying conversation about that.
Tomorrow on Take Two with Jerry and Debbie on most of these EWTN stations.
Now we return to Call to Communion.
Call to Communion on this Thursday afternoon here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. Let's get back right to it now. Here is Hebrew in Wellington, Florida, listening on the TuneIn Radio app. Hebrew, what's on your mind today?
Yes, guys, I love the show, and I am a Catholic, and I have a son who's suffering. He's been suffering for 10 years, and I'm calling to see if I can get some, like an answer. I know suffering has meaning for us as adults, but I'm wondering, I'm always asking, what's good for my child? What good can come out of suffering?
Yes.
For him.
Yes. So first of all, I am so sorry. I am so sorry that your family is going through this. I am so sorry. And I hope very much that you have good friends and family and Catholic clergy and Catholic lay people who can love you and be compassionate to you and be present to you when you and your child are suffering. We are so sorry. The short answer is that we can never know what good God has in mind through some particular form of suffering. And we know that God has some good in mind. We might never know what that good is or how it is going to be realized in this particular soul. And so it calls for faith and trust in things that we cannot see, namely God's goodness, that God will bring good even out of this evil, and perhaps in ways that you might not be able to see in your lifetime. And that's a very difficult position to be in. There are some things that can make it easier. I'm going to give you one that's sort of theological and one that's a little bit more mundane. I have a good friend, and I talk about him on this radio show all the time because he's such a good example of this, who, when he was 8 or 9 years old, he drank out of a public water fountain, and he acquired a form of meningitis that caused the circulation to be cut off to his limbs. His whole body turned purple and was paralyzed. He lost consciousness and flatlined. And he was revived multiple times on the way to the hospital and told that the only way he could live was if he had all of his limbs cut off. And so he became a quadruple amputee while he was still a very young child in grammar school. There went his dream of becoming a professional baseball player. If that weren't enough for him, his mother walked out on him, told him that she never wanted to have kids anyway, abandoned him, and then he subsequently suffered a lot of very rough physical handling, bordering on abuse, and had just an enormously difficult childhood, unlike anything of almost anybody you would ever want to imagine. And I'm not. This is all public. It's in his book, No Arms, No Legs, No Problem, by Bob Luhano. And if you ask Bob today about his upbringing, about the tragedies he went through and the suffering he experienced, spiritual, emotional, family, psychological, physical, I would never say this to Bob. I would never say it about Bob. I wouldn't dare. This is what Bob says about himself. He says it was the best thing that could ever have happened to me. I would never dare say that to someone. But he says it about himself because he's conscious, he's aware of the good that God has done in his life. He's a devout Catholic, he's married, he's got a family, he's got a career, he's a magnificent human being who's full of charity and compassion and is one of the least judgmental people I've ever known, and brings happiness and joy to everyone he meets. It is evident to me that God brought tremendous good out of the suffering that he experienced. There is no way on this planet that I could look at an 8-year-old child who had that kind of tragedy and say to him, oh, well, God's going to bring good out of this. That would be so insensitive, and I can't possibly know that what the good is that will be realized. So pastorally, I have one response, which is to try to come alongside people who are suffering and tell them that they're loved, to be present, not to try to explain because I don't know. But I'm also able to step back and see theologically and in history that even though I may not know in the present, there are enough instances where great good comes out of it that you can look back after 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 80 years and say, okay, now I'm just beginning to see. Mm-hmm. Now I'm just beginning to see. So, that's the other thing I would say, and this was the more kind of highfalutin theological answer, is that Christ suffered. Christ suffered because he gives us that kind of presence, the one I spoke of at first, the one that just, instead of giving you all the answers, comes by and holds your hand. Christ suffered with us. He entered into solidarity with us. He suffered every kind of pain and indignity and trauma and distress that a human being can suffer. And he suffered more greatly than anybody else, so that whatever we've experienced, we know he's also experienced it with us. And we can, when we're experiencing suffering, we may not have rational understanding, but we can turn for friendship, for companionship, for empathy from the one who suffered on our behalf.
Hebrew, thank you so much for your call. We'd appreciate hearing from you. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go to Hope now in Melbourne, Florida, listening on Divine Mercy Catholic Radio, a first-time caller. Hey there, Hope. What's on your mind today?
Thank you for taking the call. I met Dr. Anders at a conference here several years ago.
I remember.
I should have asked him then.
I remember.
Thank you. My question is, because I became Catholic in 2014. I was a former Baptist, and before that, I was in the Christian church. And in both the Christian church and Baptist church, they emphasize baptism as immersion. They say that's the correct definition of baptism, baptissimo, I believe they call it. And so I was rather surprised when the Catholic Church didn't do immersion. Now, I understand the pouring of the water, the 3 times but why that instead of immersion?
Okay.
Because the way we were taught the Bible, Jesus went under. Thank you.
Nope. Sorry. I have to stop you there on that last statement. Bible doesn't say that. Does not say Jesus went under. Does not say it. Doesn't say it. Does he went down into the water. Doesn't say he was immersed. Doesn't say it. Now, here is the mistake your Baptist friends make. There is a very simple exegetical error. I mean, the books on exegesis that say, don't do this error. It's called the etymological fallacy. What is the etymological fallacy? The etymological fallacy is assuming that the historical origin of a word necessarily captures its meaning. That's just false. It's just historically false. Lots of words don't mean, in vernacular language, the same thing that their etymology would suggest. Think about this is kind of a trivial example, but think about the words in modern English vernacular, bad and cool.
Mm-hmm.
They mean good and hot. The etymology doesn't tell you the meaning, all right? And if you can make a case that baptismo derives etymologically from the word that means to immerse, that doesn't mean the word in Greek means immerse. That's an exegetical fallacy. The word baptismo in the New Testament means not to immerse, it means to baptize. That's what it means. It means to baptize. It doesn't mean immerse. It means baptize. The New Testament is, in fact, almost silent on the question of the mode of baptism. Well, we can infer in a few places. We know that when St. Paul was baptized, he was baptized in a household. Most households in Judea in the ancient world didn't have bathtubs. We know that the Ethiopian eunuch went down into a ditch on the side of the road. Right? We know that when the crowds gathered to hear St. Peter preach in the temple courts on Pentecost, that 3,000 were baptized in a day. No indication that they left the temple courts. Nothing in there about them trudging down to the Jordan and diving in.
Yeah.
Right? And even Christ's baptism in the Jordan, there's nothing in the text that says he was immersed. Nothing. Not one word about it. So the only way we can know questions about the mode of the sacraments is if we turn to the actual rule of faith given to us by Jesus. Christ gave us a means to know the Christian faith, and it wasn't the gospel accounts. That's not what the gospel accounts are for. He gave us the teaching church to tell us about the content of the Christian faith, including the proper mode of celebrating the sacraments. There's only way you can know. There's only one way you can know how to perform a sacrament properly, and that's with reference to Catholic tradition. Oral tradition, unwritten tradition. That's the source of divine revelation that Christ gave us to actually understand the proper mode of the sacraments. The scriptures themselves are almost completely silent on the mode. Now, you know the old joke about the Presbyterian and the Baptist walking down the road. Two preachers, and Presbyterians, of course, sprinkled. And they're having an argument about the mode of baptism.
Uh-huh.
And the Presbyterian turns to the Baptist guy and he says, well, if you just got your feet in the water, would it count? He says, no. How about up to your knees? Would it count? Baptist says, no. Up to the shoulders? Would it count? Baptist says, no. He says, if you go all the way and get your head under, would it count? Baptist says, yes. Presbyterian says, see, it's the water on top of the head that counts.
Very cool. All right, Hope, thanks so much. We hope that that's helpful for you. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Yeah, I want to tell you about a wonderful brand new book now available from EWTN Publishing, Toil and Transcendence, Catholicism in 20th Century America by Father Charles Connor. He is a wonderful writer. This is a very cool book. The Catholic hierarchy and laity factored into many of the great stories of 20th century America, which are told here by one of our country's foremost experts on Catholic American history. If you've ever read anything by Father Charles Connor, you know how good it is and how he really brings people to life. There's probably a whole chapter on Al Smith. People don't know who Al Smith is, but in this election year of 2020, some people are thinking about, Al Smith, who was the first Catholic to run for the presidency here in the United States, at least to my knowledge. Anyway, check out the book, Toil and Transcendence, Catholicism in 20th Century America. It's available now at EWTNRC.com. Buy Catholic, shop Catholic. EWTNRC.com. A very cool book, I'm sure. Looking forward to reading it myself. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go to John now in Hughstown, Pennsylvania, listening on the great JMJ Catholic Radio. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
Hi, thanks for having me. I heard Dr. Anders respond to the person who posed the issue about God hating and having feelings, and I, heard his exegesis on it. And I'm wondering if that also applies to Jesus. I know Jesus was God also.
Yes.
Because every time, especially, lately I've been listening to some tapes of Bishop Sheen. He makes it an issue to say, when you sin, you hurt God. You're hurting the Lord. And I just can't reconcile that with, again, the fact. And another thing is that I think he said something about, when you're in pain, just know that God knows you're in pain because Jesus went through pain. Well, I expect that God would know all about pain, even if Jesus didn't come.
Sure. I understand the question. So let me draw a couple distinctions, if I could. Jesus Christ, the Catholic Church teaches, is a divine person and a human person. Is a single person, has two natures, divine and human. And to have a human nature, the human natures are passable. They are changeable. They can suffer. They can grow. They can develop. They can die. And Christ was fully human, and in his humanity, he had all those attributes, all those properties. And so the human nature of Christ has sensible emotion. Compassion is one of them. And as any parent knows, when your child suffers, you hurt. You hurt empathetically when your child hurts. And you wish you could hurt for them. Right?
Yeah.
You don't always wish you could make their mistakes, but you
Yes.
hurt for them.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And of course Christ felt that way. And you remember as he's on his way to the cross, he laments, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how long, how often I long to gather you under my wings like a hen with her chicks, and yet you were unwilling." What parent has not ever felt that way? Palpable emotion in the human soul of Christ. The divinity of Christ, unchangeable, eternal, immutable, simple, and infinite. Now, sacred scripture uses anthropomorphic language about God because this is a figurative and analogous way of speaking to help us relate, because we are not infinite and eternal and utterly simple and beyond change. And it not only ascribes emotion to God, but even physical motion. God walking in a garden. God doesn't walk in gardens. God doesn't have feet, right? Not the divinity, no feet.
Yeah.
Right? Can't walk without feet. But this is a figurative way of speaking to capture and depict God's presence, God's companionship, God's ubiquity, God's closeness. And it's not inappropriate language, and so it's richly appropriate for Bishop Sheen to employ biblical language and biblical metaphor in describing God, because there's something in God that's like compassion. There's something in God that's like empathetic suffering. There's something in God. Every perfection that you can ascribe to the human person has its nature and its origin in God, but in an immanent way that is consistent with his immutability and unchangeableness and all the rest of it. So can we use this language in a devotional way to elicit our own devotion, our own affection towards God, understanding? And of course, there's a developmental awareness we have of God. I mean, we understand God one way when we're a child. St. Paul says, when I was a child, I thought as a child, spoke as a child, acted as a child, became an adult, put childish ways behind us. And so, we can use this kind of language with the child, because I can't use categories like infinite and simple and eternal and unchangeable and immutable with the child, right? And even now, today, of course, it's comforting to read the Psalms that depict God as a shepherd. God's not a shepherd. It's a metaphor. God doesn't carry a shepherd's crook and stand on top of a hill wearing a turban, but it's a metaphor, and it helps me understand and relate to his closeness, his nearness, and his unchanging love.
Okay. And we appreciate your call, John. Thanks for checking in from Hughestown, Pennsylvania. Call to communion here on EWTN. Hey, let's go to Frank in Parkersburg, West Virginia right now, listening on WOUX 105.3 FM. Hello, Frank. What's on your mind today?
Yes, Dr. Anderson. I had a question concerning annulments. Was Jesus the author, and did he validate the annulment procedure? And also, where in the Bible is the procedure described?
Yes, absolutely. So, yes, it's from Jesus. He talks about it in Matthew chapter 19. But if you want to see it sort of explicated legally and how it was actually utilized in the early church, you'd look at St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians from chapters 5 to 7. So Jesus says that it is not lawful to divorce your wife for any reason. That's what he says. When the Pharisees say, can we divorce our wives? Moses said we could divorce our wives. He says no. They say, well, then why did Moses allow us to write a certificate of divorce? And he says, well, because of your hardness of heart, but it wasn't like that from the beginning. What God has joined together, let man not separate. And then he goes on to, so he categorically rejects the possibility of divorce of any kind. But then he goes on to say, seem to make an exception in the case of a category called porneia. The Greek word is porneia. That doesn't mean adultery. The Greek word for adultery is mokeia. He uses another word, porneia, which can refer to all kinds of violations of sexual, moral, and purity codes. So it's a little bit ambiguous. What is he talking about? What is this exception that he's talking about, porneia? Well, when we move over into 1 Corinthians, we see St. Paul put this teaching into practice. And here was the situation. You had a man in Corinth who married his stepmother. He married his stepmother. That was invalid. It was against the law. It violated the rules on consanguinity. You can't marry somebody that is within a certain degree of consanguinity, relatedness. And in the law, Jewish law especially of the time, your stepmother was out of bounds. And Paul said, this is an invalid union. It's intrinsically immoral, and it's wrong. The man is required to repudiate the woman. And if he doesn't, in fact, he's going to be excommunicated. And that's precisely what happened. The guy didn't. He was excommunicated. Then in 2 Corinthians, he comes to his senses, and he repudiates the woman, and he gets back in the church.
Okay.
Then Paul goes on in chapter 6 and 7 to describe other circumstances that are relevant. And he talks specifically about what happens. Christians should not get divorced, but if they do, they have to remain unmarried. They can't marry again, right? Because they're still validly married to the first person unless they reconcile to their husband. But he then spells out other exceptions where it would be permitted for somebody to lawfully separate from their wife and take somebody else because the first one would be regarded as invalid. And he lays these things out. He doesn't use the language of validity and annulment. I mean, that's technical language that the church employs to try to capture these concepts.
Right.
But they're very much derived from the teaching of Jesus and the lived example of the apostles. Yes, absolutely.
Cecil, thank you so much for your call. Let's go now to Frank in Parkersburg, West Virginia, listening on WOU. No, that was Frank. Now we're going to go to Cecil. I got it right. Cecil is in Owensboro, Kentucky, listening on Savior Radio, a first-time caller. Hey there, Cecil. What's on your mind today?
Hi, how are you doing today?
Very well. Thank you for your call. What's up today?
Okay, in Romans chapter 13, it mentions that we're all subject to the power of God, and He is the power, and we're ordained by His power. And I'd just like for that to be explained, and then it goes on into chapter 2. If we don't receive that, we're in damnation.
Okay, thanks. So Romans chapter 13, verse 1, it instructs us to be subject to governing authorities. We're talking about the civil authorities in the state, which are instituted by God for the common good. So how shall we apply this in the context of our lives? Well, when government is instituted for the sake of the common good, we have to regard the common good. So let me give you an example. It is necessary that the government of the United States, or my state government in Alabama, issue laws about which side of the road I have to drive on and what the speed limit is. Those laws don't exist for my own private good. Maybe I like the left side of the road better. It's not about my private good. It's about the common good of society. This is necessary for the peace and order of civilization, that we all agree to be on the right side of the road, at least in Alabama, right? And there's nothing absolute about 55 miles an hour on state highways. I mean, you could make it 56 or 54, and it wouldn't make a substantial difference to the outcome. Yeah. But you got to pick some speed, and the governing authority has the right to do that. Now, if I am charitable to my neighbor, if I really love my neighbor as myself, I'm going to recognize that it ain't all about me. The world does not exist, to serve me. And I have to regard the common good. And to do that, I have to recognize the legitimacy of the civil authorities that have a duty of care for the common good. Now, what about a tyranny? Am I obligated to recognize the authority of a tyranny that by definition does not serve the common good, but its own good? Certainly not, especially insofar as that tyranny would command me to violate conscience. If it's a matter of indifference, of moral indifference, then I might have an obligation to obey a tyranny because it might actually promulgate things that would accidentally serve the common good, like speed limits. But when a tyranny says you have to do something like kill your children or divorce your wife or you can't worship God or things of this nature, then no, I don't have an obligation to obey tyranny.
Okay, Cecil, thanks so much for your call. Real quick, here's Lexi in Pell City listening on Sirius XM. Hey, Lexi, we've got about a minute. What's on your mind today?
Just a question. I have been told that the Pope has only used the office of St. Peter to speak infallibly twice in history. Is this true?
No, that's not true. Sorry, not true. The Pope has only made ex cathedra infallible pronouncements twice, clearly, I mean, this is arguable, but clearly twice since the dogma of papal infallibility was promulgated at the First Vatican Council. But the Pope was infallible long before Vatican I, just like God was a Trinity before the Council of Nicaea, all right? And there were multiple instances in Catholic history when the popes have taught authoritatively on a matter of dogma. One that comes to my mind in the 14th century was the encyclical Benedictus Deus by Benedict XII that defined the dogma of the beatific vision for the blessed dead. But I could come up with many others. No, it's just not true.
Okay, very good. Lexi, glad we could get your call in kind of at the 11th hour, if it were, as it were. Hey, Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Well, thanks, Tom.
Don't forget, we do the program Monday through Friday here on EWTN Radio, 2 p.m. Eastern, with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern, and a best of show Sundays at 2 p.m. Eastern. On behalf of our fantastic team, that would be Charles and Ryan and Jeff, I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders. See you tomorrow here on the Friday edition of Call to Communion on EWTN. God bless.